Trump is president, which means immigration will never be the same.
We are going to start the largest mass deportation in the history of our country because we have no choice.
There are changes that Trump wants to make based on my political analysis of his past and the presidential campaign. Some touch illegal immigrants, while others affect legal migrants in the country. Sit back and watch a breakdown based on the existing legal frameworks, resources, and political realities to see what may hold him back. Number 1. Logistical challenges of mass deportation of 11 million people. Current capacity of ICE, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has around 8,000 deportation officers. In 2023, they were able to deport only around 140,000 individuals. To deport 11 million undocumented immigrants, ICE would have to significantly expand its workforce and the budget. If the same deportation rate were to continue, it would take roughly 78 years to deport 11 million immigrants under the current capacity. Expansion of ICE. To carry out mass deportations, ICE would need to recruit, train, and deploy many more officers, which requires congressional approval for increased funding. This expansion could take years and would likely face political opposition in Congress, especially from Democrats and immigration advocates. Logistical overload. Detaining, processing, and deporting millions would overwhelm immigration courts even with the increased funding. Detention centers would suffer and the transportation infrastructure. The U.S. immigration court system already has a backlog of millions of cases. Additional deportations could cripple the system. Number 2. Legal and constitutional barriers. Sanctuary cities. Many U.S. cities have policies that limit cooperation with ICE on deportations. While Trump previously threatened to cut off federal funding to sanctuary cities, such actions were met with legal challenges. The courts ruled in favor of the sanctuary cities, stating that the federal government cannot withhold funding as a coercive measure. Can he ban sanctuary cities, you may ask? Trump, even as president, cannot unilaterally ban sanctuary cities without significant legal challenges. Sanctuary cities and their policies are based on the 10th Amendment, which protects states' rights to refuse to enforce federal mandates. It would require new federal legislation, which is unlikely to pass given the legal precedent and the split in political opinion. Limited federal leverage. He could attempt to issue executive orders, but those would likely face legal challenges, much like his attempt to withhold funding from sanctuary jurisdictions in his first term. The courts would almost certainly rule against such actions on constitutional grounds. Number 3. Military and National Guard involvement. The Pazea Comitatus Act of 1878 limits the use of the military for domestic law enforcement purposes, including immigration enforcement. This law prohibits using active duty military personnel for civilian law enforcement activities, such as rounding up and deporting immigrants. National Guard. The National Guard could potentially be on Trump's side in some states, but it still requires local cooperation from governors. If Trump were to use the National Guard, it would require state-level cooperation, and many state governors, particularly in sanctuary states, California and New York, are unlikely to comply, while Texas and Georgia may give him full-force National Guard. Insurrection Act. Trump could invoke the Insurrection Act, which allows the president to deploy military forces domestically in specific emergency situations. However, this would be an extreme measure and would face massive political and legal opposition, as well as public backlash. There would also need to be a credible justification for invoking this act, and mass deportations may not meet the criteria. But Trump has surprised us many times in the past, so let's see if he does this one. Number 4. Ideological screening for legal immigrants. Legal precedents. The U.S. Constitution and immigration law already require certain forms of screening. For example, criminal records, terrorism links, all that stuff, which is really helpful for the security of the nation. However, adding ideological screening would face significant legal hurdles due to the First Amendment protections, which guarantee freedom of thought, speech, and belief. I'm emphasizing belief in this context. A broad ideological test would be seen as unconstitutional. The US already uses screening mechanisms like background checks and security assessments for legal immigrants and refugees. Expanding these tools to include subjective ideological assessments could face legal challenges on the grounds of religious and political discrimination, also the discrimination of belief. Muslim ban precedent. Trump previously issued a travel ban targeting citizens from majority Muslim countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Yemen, and others. Though the ban faced legal challenges, it was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court in a narrow form in 2018, however, creating a blanket ideological screening process for all legal immigrants would be a much broader and more controversial step and would face challenges based on religious freedom and equal protection under the law and the Constitution. Number 5. Executive orders and travel bans. Trump's Muslim ban targeted citizens from specific countries, as I mentioned before, because of the terrorism justification. If he wanted to roll out something similar, he would need to justify it on national security grounds, very similar to the first one. But expanding it to a broader ideological ban would be more difficult and legally challenging. The courts were divided even on the narrower travel ban, and a wider ideological test would likely not withstand judicial scrutiny. Trump could try to issue another executive order that targets specific groups or nations, but these would almost certainly face legal challenges again. So it's all about the courts. Who controls the courts controls the executive orders. We'll see if Trump's majority in the Supreme Court helps or acts against him in this specific case. Number 6, political opposition and public backlash. Congressional approval. To expand deportation efforts and impose new screening measures, Trump would need substantial support in Congress, which is not guaranteed, particularly in the Senate. Immigration remains one of the most divisive political issues, and Democrats are likely to oppose any mass deportation efforts. Public opinion. Public opinion on immigration is sharply divided, and mass deportation efforts could provoke significant public backlash, protests, and civil unrest. Many businesses, particularly in sectors reliant on immigration labor, agriculture, construction, hospitality, may also resist these efforts due to the economic impact. So I'm talking about the business friends that Trump has. Conclusion. While Trump could push for mass deportations of 11 million people and ideological screenings that cover everybody in the country, through executive orders, he would face overwhelming logistical, legal, and political challenges. The scale of deportation would require years, even decades, to accomplish with current resources, and any expansion of ICE would depend on congressional approval. Sanctuary cities would likely continue to defy federal mandates with legal backings, and using the military for such purposes would likely violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Ideological screening for immigrants would face constitutional challenges, especially on First Amendment grounds. Even if Trump uses his executive authority as president, legal battles would continue.
They're tired of what's happened to our country. Our country's become a crime-ridden mess.